Welcome back to Give the People What They Want. I'm Zoe Alexandra, very excited to be back with you. As always, I'm joined by Prasanth and Roger McKenzie. We have a lot to get to today. There was a war, a ceasefire, very intense stuff. We'll get into it right after. So stay.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want.
Give the people what they want. Your weekly movement news roundup.
So last week, we were speaking about the Israeli attacks on Iran, the threats of a possible U.S. attack. A lot happened since last Wednesday, Prasanth. Can you catch us up to speed on what's the scene in Iran?
Right, Zoe, it's quite a bit of a zigzag week, so to speak. I think last week we spoke when it was the 18th and the 19th, I believe. So that has been 6 days since Israel had started its unprovoked attack and Iran was firing back. And at that point, the question on everyone's mind was that would the United States join this conflict or not? We knew that the kind of pressures Donald Trump was facing. Obviously, the neoconservative sections in his administration, the Zionist lobbies which are part of his establishment, Trump's own inclination to he himself had jumped onto the bandwagon, started terming the conflict as something we were doing, we meaning the US and Israel at that point, and completely buying into this whole narrative about the Iran nuclear weapons program, which we must, again, I think it's very essential to point out this one fact, the fact that everyone on record has said that Iran has no nuclear weapons, and it is it's 100% clear that Israel has nuclear weapons. And I think it's very essential to point that out, that anytime there's a discussion on this, we need to keep pointing out that fact that Israel has around 90 nuclear bombs, if I'm not mistaken. And these have never been inspected. These are not under any kind of regulation because Israel has not signed any global treaties. And it continues to be the only nuclear weapons power in the region, and the true danger to the region in multiple ways. But what we did see on Saturday was that the United States launched attacks on three Iranian nuclear facilities, claimed that it had obliterated all of them, although very soon evidence came to light that was not the case. First of all, it is clear the Iranians had already taken their precautions, as any sensible power would do. And secondly, the satellite imagery, and now increasingly more and more media reports are making it clear that nothing of that sort was achieved. Now, Iran did strike back with missiles at the US base in Qatar. Again, equally important to ask that question every time we talk about is why are there so many US bases in that region? What is the United States seeking to achieve through this process? It's clear, but I think it's a question nonetheless we need to keep asking. And after that, then there was this so-called ceasefire. I mean, it is a ceasefire, but nonetheless, it's one of those strange ceasefires where Trump announces it over social media. There is no clarity on what it means, what it doesn't mean. He gives a very strange timeline. Iran stops attacks first, and then apparently Israel stops attacks later. We do know that Israel violated that, of course, as is to be expected. But for now, the ceasefire seems to be holding. Now, I think there are a couple of important questions on everyone's mind. It's probably difficult to kind of answer them concretely. The first is, will the ceasefire hold? There is no way of saying that, because probably Israel is one of the most bad faith negotiators in the history of bad faith negotiators. I mean, I don't think over the past, in the past 1 or 2 years alone, we have seen so many violations of ceasefire agreements, so many violations of various decisions and plans and all that Israel absolutely cannot be trusted. It can conjure up an excuse at any point of time to resume its attacks. It is very clear. On the other hand, one must note that what do seem to have been the so-called aims, or Israel's so-called aims, have not really been successful, in the sense that has it destroyed Iran's nuclear program? Clearly, no. Has it, it is obvious from the very beginning that it was looking at some kind of regime change, if not as the main aim, but definitely as something that was very much on the table. Has that happened? No. In fact, most reports, even from sources critical of Iran, say that there has been an upsurge in patriotic sentiment. People have come together, and that's obviously going to happen when you're subject to such an attack. Iran and the United States and all their allies kept manufacturing these narratives about how Iran was, I meant Israel, how Iran was just a country waiting to collapse. and everyone was so unhappy, they were waiting to collapse. But that's a complete misjudgment, and in some ways an almost racist kind of framing of the world, because political complexity and agency for people are only for people in the West, whereas when you judge the people, when you analyze the people in the global South, it's all about religion, it's all about ethnicity, it's all about fractures and that kind of stuff. And I think that's the narrative that both Washington and Tel Aviv have kind of swallowed. And I suspect that was one reason behind, guiding those who thought that if they just went with a couple of bombs, that is all it would take to lead Iran to crumble. It's obviously not the case. And as far as the third clear war aim was concerned, as far as Israel was concerned, which is that, or to bring the United States into the war. Now, they did to some extent do so. I mean, they did to the extent that clearly this was all planned and coordinated. The United States had a complete idea of what was happening. They did manage to get the US also into, bombing those three sites. But did they manage a repeat of Iraq 2003? Clearly not. And that would definitely have been what Netanyahu wanted, especially for his own political career. Obviously, whether now this is not going to distract from what they've been trying in Gaza, this is clearly going to strengthen the forces of resistance across the region, because they've seen that Iran managed to, survive, managed to fight back, and is still standing at the end of, after receiving all Israel's brutal firepower. And in fact, if anything, it was Israel's military power that was, exposed in some senses, because reports were immediately emerging of how short of certain missiles they are, etc., etc. So overall, I think this is a very key moment, because Iran made it very clear that this is not going to be a repeat of 2003 Iraq, and this completely sets the plans of those in the strategic headquarters across the global north in disarray. So I mean, it really, we need to see what's going to happen. It's very difficult to calculate, but I think for Iran, the key question is definitely how are they going to address the nuclear issue? How do they go back to negotiations knowing that these negotiations are in bad faith? But is it possible to completely withdraw from them? Will they secretly work on a nuclear weapons program? If they do, one can't blame them. On the other hand, it is unfortunate if there are more nuclear weapons coming in this world, is the way to say it. But I think Iran will draw the lessons which North Korea drew, that if you don't possess a nuclear weapon, you are more at risk. And the entire only reason for that is how the US and its allies have been behaving. So I think tough choices for Iran, but they have managed to come out of this very, very difficult moment with their heads held high, and will be able to move ahead. So very interesting moment in the region right now.
Definitely, and we've been covering this very closely at People's Dispatch. I recommend reading Vijay Prashad's article about how this will impact nuclear proliferation, as some of the things that you laid out just now, Prasanth. But as we know, this is not the only unilateral war that Israel is waging. Israel continues to commit the genocide in Gaza. Roger, what's been happening in Gaza for the past week?
Well, I think as the eyes of the world have been on Iran, it's been really interesting to see how sections of the media have forgotten that this genocide is still taking place in Gaza. The people of Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, certainly won't have forgotten what's happening to them, because they're experiencing it every day. There's real famine across Gaza. When Palestinians try to get food in from these bogus mercenaries who are running supposedly these humanitarian aid centers, the Israelis are just gunning people down, and the whole setup is a nightmare, frankly, for the Palestinians. The nightmare continues. There's no ceasefire at all. in sight. And of course, what we know is that it was the Israelis who broke the last ceasefire. Again, as Prasanth was saying earlier on, they must be the most unreliable partners to try and negotiate anything with. I used to be a negotiator, and one of the things that you have to have as a negotiator is some trust that the person you're negotiating with is negotiating in good faith. There's no good faith at all from the Israelis. It is clear that they are intent on wiping out as many Palestinians as they possibly can. That's clear from what happens at these aid centers. Just imagine you have people who are hungry, who are desperate for food, who are walking towards these aid centres and are just simply gunned down. And they know that there's a strong possibility of that happening, but they're still going to try and get some food because they need food, their children need food, their families need food. So what's happening there is frankly disgusting. And when we see that the US government has just announced that they're going to give $30 million to this mercenary firm to continue to run this aid center. It smacks of corruption completely. It's not just political activists saying that. Aid organizations like Oxfam US are saying similar things as well. So when you look at it in that context, then there is something desperately wrong at the moment. And I think it says a lot that the US government finds it, trumpets out its ability to be able to reach a ceasefire in Iran, but has made no effort whatsoever to persuade the Israelis to stop their genocide in Gaza. There is no ceasefire on the agenda. There's not even any talks on the agenda as far as I can see, just in the last few hours as we speak. What I've seen is that at least 79 Palestinians have been killed, most of them trying to approach these aid centers. What is the positive thing that can come out of this is that people are still protesting around the world. People are still marching. People are still calling for a ceasefire and an end to this horrendous genocide. In fact, there is no other type of genocide than horrendous type of genocide. So what we need to do is to make sure the attention of the world goes right back onto what's happening to the Palestinians, that we refocus what is happening, and that we make it loud and clear that there must be a ceasefire and humanitarian aid must be allowed to come through to help these poor, starving people who have been subjected to this by the Israelis, but of course by the US, who are absolutely complicit in all of this.
Yeah, I think it's a very concerning moment, and it's interesting to note that, just a week and 2 weeks back, the G7 was meeting in Canada. Right now, the NATO summit is happening in The Hague, which is, of course, incredibly ironic given the fact that The Hague is where the International Criminal Court is located, the same body that issued warrants for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now all of those global North nations, NATO partners, are meeting in The Hague in the very same place to discuss how to rearm Europe, how to increase militarization, how to, continue these wars. And of course, absolutely no talk about the necessity for a ceasefire, the necessity to actually decrease wars from happening, to move away from militarism, to move towards a world of peace. We don't see any of that happening right now. And it's interesting, the NATO summit, of course, as I said, in The Hague, there's been a ton of protests that have been happening across Europe. In The Hague, there was a peace summit this past weekend. In Brussels, thousands of organizers gathered for also a peace summit with multiple discussions. Of course, peace, militarism. Why is Donald Trump pushing for this 5% spending? In Italy, massive mobilizations against this demand for 5%, against the demand for the rearming of Europe. So even though all of these warmongers are meeting in Europe, with this agenda, the people of Europe have really woken up and see that this 5% demand for military spending, of course, would impact their livelihood. So there's been a really, really interesting round of mobilizations that we're seeing, and I think those are definitely going to continue. So interesting time. No looking towards peace, but of course, increasing war. And on that note, Prasanth, very important peace process ongoing right now. Some difficulties in it. Tell us about the DRC-Rwanda deal.
Right. So the agreement is supposed to be signed on the 27th. That's day after tomorrow between the DRC and Rwanda. And it is supposed to, it's a big if, end the fighting that has really peaked since the beginning of the year, end of last year, when the M23 group took the city of Goma and advanced even further into the DRC. Now, this is a very controversial deal because, of course, on the face of it, all peace deals are good. If fighting stops, that's great. But like I said, it's a big if as to whether this agreement will actually stop the fighting, whether the M23 will accept the terms. There's also a separate process going on involving the M23. They did sign a ceasefire. They did agree to a ceasefire, but that did not stop them from continuing their fighting. So we really don't know how this deal is going to work. But I think the important thing here to note is that this is really not just a peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda. This is actually more of a minerals deal between the United States and the DRC. And basically, from the very beginning, President Felix Tshisekedi of the Congo has tried to sell the idea of a peace deal to Donald Trump by offering a lot of his country's very vital minerals, or offering the possibility of the US having access to those minerals. That is really the peg on which this deal was sold. And I think People's Dispatch has some great pieces on that, which actually reflect the fact that, for instance, the parliament was not consulted about the peace deal. It was just announced in the press, and Trump has been very open about it. The fact that this is really about the minerals. And he's not making any pretense that this is about some noble idea of peace, although he's claiming a Nobel Prize for that. But he's very clear that this is about the minerals, that this deal is really about the minerals. So we'll actually have to wait and see if this actually leads to any decree, an end to the fighting. The terms on paper look good. There's a lot of talk about ending disarmament, ending escalation, integrating armed groups, etc., non-sovereign armed groups, etc., etc., all of which looks great on paper. But like I said, there have been a lot of such agreements in the past. None of them have really worked out. The M23 itself has had various iterations in the past. This M23 is just their latest names. This group has its origins in the genocidal wars waged against the people of the Congo from the late 90s onwards, in which Rwanda and Uganda were complicit. There's never been any justice for that. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, has been around since that time, continues to be in power, modeled himself as this kind of effective African president, and portray himself as a model of how African states should be run, whereas a lot of it is run through smuggling minerals from the DRC. Important to note that the areas the M23 controls, a lot of the mineral wealth in that areas is actually smuggled to the DRC. The M23 imposes a tax on it, that those minerals go into Rwanda. Rwanda then exports those minerals as its own, and the share of mineral wealth as far as Rwanda is concerned is drastically increased over the years, especially over the past 1.5 years. So this is a very important, this is what is happening is not just some kind of random fighting or an ethnic conflict, which is how a lot of the coverage earlier used to be, but a very clear economic campaign of stripping the people of the Congo of their resources and not allowing them to exercise that kind of sovereignty, right? Now, what if the fighting does stop? I think one of the proposals is that we legalize this process of sending minerals to Rwanda. So it's not that the people of the Congo really have a choice in terms of how the resources are going to be used. It's just that they're going to, the US aim is probably to substitute what they call an illegal, and what is clearly an illegal way of smuggling minerals into what they would call a legal way of doing things, right? But still, it doesn't change really. It doesn't really change the outcome so much. So I think that's the key question here. And that is one reason why I guess it's so unpopular in the Congo. The idea that they're buying peace with minerals, with the mineral wealth that should actually belong to them. And we just saw a couple of days ago that Niger has actually nationalized its uranium mines. It has taken it over from the French company Orano. So there's that model happening in one part of the continent, and the other part you see, the elite in the DRC, the elite in Rwanda, all of them, of course, fighting with each other, but all of them in some senses also united in terms of the direction, which is that to allow the extraction of this incredible mineral wealth so that the countries in the West benefit. And this is exactly what Trump and his associates want as well. So I think we'll really have to wait and see what lies behind this peace deal. Two questions. Will this deal actually work on the ground? Big question. Thousands of Rwandan soldiers are in the Congo, so it's a big question. And question number two, even if the fighting temporarily stops, will it actually lead to any true sovereignty for the people? That's really the big question. And that question, I don't think, unfortunately, is going to be addressed by this deal.
Yeah, and this deal is another one of the kind of peace processes that Trump is claiming to, take ownership over, with Marco Rubio right at the center. Of course, we have to be extremely wary of that, especially given the fact that mineral wealth has driven violence in the Congo for decades. And this kind of band-aid solution and, siphoning off their resources is definitely not going to be a lasting peace. So, of course, we have to continue to watch that situation. Roger, tell us about these reports of abuse of Saudi workers.
Yeah, sure. In a sense, this is another story of African workers, because this is about how migrant workers from Africa have long faced discrimination within Saudi Arabia, and, as I'll explain as well, within Britain as well, because the Africa section of the International Trade Union Confederation has been raising this for years about the abuses being faced by migrant workers from Africa going to Saudi. There is no other way of describing this other than modern day slavery, frankly. They have no rights at all. They have no holidays, nothing like that at all. This is where their ability to stay in the country is tied to their job. And it's also tied to their accommodation as well. And often they're, of course, we often see Africans trafficked into Saudi Arabia as well to work for nothing. The ITUC Africa has had a massive success, actually. So this is partly a good news story, at least the first part of what I'm about to say is. Because ITUC Africa has managed to persuade the international, one of these bodies affiliated to the International Labour Committee, it's called. They have been persuaded to carry out an investigation into what's facing migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. That's a huge victory, because the Saudis have used all their weight, all of their pressure to try and stop this from happening. So it'd be really interesting to see how far that investigation goes, and hopefully that will lead to some decent rights coming to those African workers in Saudi Arabia, and indeed other workers from outside of Saudi Arabia who are coming in to that country as well. Now, last week I spent the week at Unison's conference. So Unison, the largest trade union in Britain, and in the interest of openness, the union that I used to work for as well. And one of the stories that I heard was, it's a big debate across the conference actually about the treatment of migrant workers in Britain as well. And again, very, very similar to what's happening to migrant workers in Saudi Arabia. The ability for these workers to stay is based on a visa requirement that says you are tied to an employer. And that employer often provides really substandard, horrible accommodation for those people to stay in as well. But I heard stories of not only abuse in the workplace and people being told that they must do unreasonable hours and all of this stuff, but I heard about sexual exploitation as well, because in the main we're talking about migrant workers in the care sector in particular, who are women, and people thinking that they had to put up with this sexual exploitation because if they didn't, they were going to get kicked out of their country, and their kids, if they had any, were going to be lose their their kind of education opportunities as well. So there's pressure being applied applied by Unison and other unions to try and bring some more regulation to this sector as well, which must be welcomed. But I think it's something that we have to keep an eye on to pressure the British government to make sure that these this exploitation of these migrant workers, which they must have known about, is dealt with once and for all. There's no way that the government didn't know that this sort of treatment was taking place, but the whole regime was set up for the benefit of the employers. There's a surprise, and certainly not to treat workers with any kind of notion that they had some dignity and respect in the workplace, and in fact that they were human beings. So it's something that I'll report back on, because I think that it's something that the trade union movement in Britain needs to do much more on, because it's unacceptable to hear the sort of stories that migrant workers are telling about the gross exploitation that they're experiencing. So good news about what's happening in Saudi. Lots of work to be done about making sure that some more regulation is brought in Britain to protect these migrant workers.
And certainly it's an issue that, migrant workers face across the world. It's not only in Saudi, not only in Britain, but of course the United States, and countries even across the global south as well. So definitely important to keep our eyes on that. And, to finish off the show, we wanted to bring kind of one item of good news. And I'm happy that it's actually coming from my own city, New York. Last night or yesterday was the Democratic primaries and New York City mayoral election. Local election, maybe not something of note that maybe people are paying attention to, but I think it is a story that actually has international repercussions, that really tells a story of where the working class is at in many senses. And this battle between kind of this corrupt model and a model for change. And that is that last night in the Democratic primary, a young socialist candidate, immigrant from a Kenyan and Indian background, actually won the Democratic primary against Andrew Cuomo, who's, was the former mayor of New York. He was accused of sexual abuse. He was responsible for thousands of COVID deaths, for mismanaging the COVID pandemic, incredibly disgraced, but comes from a political dynasty, of course, popular with centrist liberals, really status quo. And he was defeated. He was defeated by a young immigrant who had a really vibrant campaign, who, of course, brought in. He actually was able to have around 50,000 volunteers that were working on his campaign. So this is not just kind of your classic old establishment candidate using the machine. This is someone who was invigorating young people, who was bringing messages of hope in a moment of a lot of scary things happening in the world. His platform was very straightforward, spoke to people's needs, spoke to what's happening across the world, which is the cost of living crisis. Saying that he's going to freeze the rents, saying that he's going to make buses free. This is things that people want to hear. And so that's why you see in this video, for example, so much excitement, really all across the city, all across the boroughs, all communities, Black, Latino, immigrant, people really getting excited about this. So it's pretty exciting news. We've seen people from across the world commenting on this because New York, people say it's the capital of the world. I don't think that's true. But this race really represented two models, which we're seeing in play across the world. And despite the fact that Andrew Cuomo was running as a Democrat, he might as well have had, a right-wing ticket, because that is kind of the ideas and the platform and program that he was representing. And then you had a left-wing young person who's really trying to bring people into his campaign, trying to challenge not only Donald Trump, but challenge kind of these ingrained ideas that exist in the United States and countries across the world, that people don't deserve education, that they don't deserve housing, that these are privileges and not rights. And so I think that's really brought a new message of what we deserve, what people deserve, what's a dignified life. So pretty exciting news. I know people here are very happy about it. There's still a race to be won that's going to happen in November, but pretty exciting news for so far. And I think it's definitely inspiring people, definitely across the United States, but I think across the world as well. and especially this important moment where we see, of course, the possible war in Iran, the continued genocide in Gaza. And of course, I should mention that Zohran is also pro-Palestine, participated in many protests against the genocide. So this is someone who's, really challenging this as well. So exciting, necessary moment. We need these victories. Also to mention that the labor reform was passed in Colombia. These are important victories, telling the working class, telling people that actually these are rights and they deserve them. So, of course, important to end on this message of hope. Keep following us at People's Dispatch. We'll bring you the stories that, of course, that's happening in the world that's bad, that's difficult, that we need to fight against, but also these stories of hope, which continue to inspire us to continue struggling and continuing having this hope for a better future.